So we're going to continue sort of our introduction to web, and at this point we're going to look at a little bit at history again. The history we've looked at so far was sort of leading up to the start of the web, and that was pretty much it. And so now we've covered a fair amount of ground. We covered a lot of ground in the first one, but there wasn't a lot happening with the web yet. It was all sort of building the backbone, the internet that would support the web. And so now we're talking about the web itself and sort of some of its history. And we talked a little bit about web history with Tim Berners-Lee, but not that much. And so this period really gets a lot more into the history of it and its development and some of the parts that are important. So in this period of time, sort of 93, 94, 95, up through late 90s, this is commonly referred to as the browser wars. And depending on who you talk to, some people say that there was just the one, sort of that time period, mid to late 90s, but some people also refer to sort of before this and maybe even after this. So 1 to 3, you can kind of decide. But this part, this middle part where we are now, we're starting to add tables and images and some of those things. That was definitely the browser war, and you can decide if you count the other ones or not. And so we have this quote here. There are a couple names in here to know. So you should already know Tim Berners-Lee, the author of the web, so to speak, the writer of HTML, the original HTML. But we also have Mark Andreessen in here, who is the creator of Mosaic. And yeah, so this is a quote from ZDNet from 1995. And it talks about 2 ages of the internet. You could definitely argue more than that now. This was 1995, so now I would definitely argue 3, if not 4, ages of the internet. And we'll talk about those later on. But there are 2 ages of the internet, before Mosaic and after. The combination of Tim Berners-Lee's web protocols, which provided connectivity, and Mark Andreessen's browser, which provided a great interface, proved explosive. In 24 months, the web has gone from being unknown to absolutely ubiquitous. So, the general public didn't know what it was, and then all of a sudden everybody wanted it, everybody knew what it was. So Mark Andreessen created Mosaic, and some people consider this the first browser war, Mosaic versus pretty much the rest. And what Mosaic did, it wasn't the only one, but it was definitely one of the first, if not the first, and it was definitely the one that caught on the fastest and gained the most popularity and sort of brought public interest to the web with what it added, with which capabilities it came with. So before Mosaic, the internet was very popular with academics, so researchers, professors, but that was about it. It was pretty much text-based only, and the general population didn't care about it. Most of them didn't know about it, definitely didn't use it. And so we went from something that looks like this. So here's 3 different browsers before Mosaic, and Mosaic was it was definitely a big deal. And so it was created by the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, the NCSA, which was it was supported by the NSF, the National Science Foundation, and it was part of the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and a super important part of internet history, of the web history. And the University of Illinois was very involved in a lot of this period of computing and of the web. And so Mosaic allowed programmers or coders to add images, sound, video, and multiple fonts into a web page. So big deal. Now, of course, the internet was extremely slow, so sound and video, not so much. But images, it could definitely handle images, and the capability was there for sound and video. You just had to wait a long time. And so it very quickly, within 2 years, Mosaic became the browser of choice that was used by pretty much everybody, and it created public interest in the web. All of a sudden you can start doing these things, and that's what gets the public interested, that's what gets them involved. So we went from something like this, lines of code, and this one is actually still being used now. This is links, and you can still use this. They still have current versions that are released. But you went to Mosaic. So Mosaic was funded by the NSF, maybe not directly, but through the NCSA. But it didn't stay Mosaic. Mosaic did not stay the most popular browser. Instead, they created Mosaic Netscape. And from Mosaic Netscape, you eventually ended up with Netscape Navigator. And that was really the big browser war, and that's kind of where we are now in, not now like today, but now in the different code that you guys have been using. And so Netscape Navigator versus Internet Explorer, this was a big deal. And everybody was using one or the other, and the vast majority, were using Netscape Navigator because we already had Mosaic, and it was kind of the next step, the next new version. And so Netscape started strong. Netscape promised to be always free, and what they did was, then how do they make money? And what they would do is they would say, if you like our software, then buy it. And you can use it for free, but if you decide you really like it, then then pay us some money for it. But what they also did was they had server software, so you could set up your own. It's a mosquito, sorry. Server software where you could pay for that to set up servers using theirs, and that's where they made most of their money, was servers. Both Netscape and Microsoft developed new codes, so they didn't just rely on the HTML that was already out. They made new code, and so some of the best well-known ones are also some of the most hated. So the blink tag, Netscape was behind that, and we'll talk about the story of that later on. The marquee tag, Netscape was behind that. Later on, Internet Explorer allows you to customize the color of your scroll bars. So they keep pushing out different code, and so you end up with this interesting and difficult, complex situation where you've got one browser that you can do these things on, and the other browser that you can do these things on, and they don't work very well. And so do you build two websites? Do you build a website that can't do a whole lot because it doesn't use any of the special code by either one? Or do you just build one and say, forget you guys? And so that becomes a problem. And we'll talk more about that later on. And then the next step, Microsoft bundles Internet Explorer into Windows. It includes it on every machine. And that was a big strike against Netscape.